It is. Yeah, I am. What
So,
are we doing? Where are we? Where did
we are
leave off?
doing the oral history project, part the 6th. This is the 6th one, and
Time flies when you're having fun, Jim.
we're on August the 13th today, and we got Jim. We've also got in attendance your name.
Aaron.
Your name.
Martin.
Here's where we always fail because I don't know. Jeff.
Jeff's nose.
Jeff's
Joe.
So I didn't flip around the thing this time. And so the previous time before the previous time, we had a bunch of email discussion in between, and we started off with those questions. So last episode was mostly a flashback episode. It was off of continuity. So the last one, we did a whole bunch of flashback stuff on the UCF. More details on that. We talked about the witches that used to meet out there. We talked about liberation theology a bit, and then we went into the 80s with the service committee from 81 to 82, kind of the work that was going on at the foundation. We talked about the voice, because we hadn't actually talked about the voice at all. And we talked about Zaire, the Zairean refugees. Then we talked about People's Alliance on Central America. This was kind of the where the sanctuary stuff was starting to happen. Then we talked about May of 82 and 83, the pre-Quakos meetings, when the whole idea of Quakos was starting to develop, and public sanctuary, and how Jim and a bunch of other people, the proto-Quakos people, Quakos formed in, I think, January of 84, we said. There was a retreat in the summer of 83, and then May of 84 is when the refugees came. But in that period of time also, Jim and other people had gone out to this conference in Tucson, and the rebellion from the grassroots came up or whatever. All the leaders were too busy arguing over what to do, so all the people who weren't the leaders ended up assuming the leadership. So Jim came back from that as one of the national leaders of Sanctuary, as well as Frankie Day?
No, Frankie didn't, but one person from California, San Francisco, and the other from Tucson.
Tucson, okay. So we pretty much ended with IDF committing to Sanctuary and starting Sanctuary, but didn't go into any of that. So we kind of ended around there. So the thought was today that we would go further into that, and then we can even flash back a little bit more into some things, and then move up into at least the first Gulf War. I think is the plan.
Something like that.
Something like that. Is that an accurate summation?
I think so.
You think so? Okay. Well, we didn't have as much discussion in the interim because last time was our discussion of the previous one. So, and we also did talk about, well, part of what we're starting to hit now, and of course we don't have name in here, but I think he just got back in town. Joe is trying to piece together his time. So we started. It was another sidebar, a sidebar to the sidebar, because Joe's first day in town.
We were all starting to kind of.
He was trying to figure out, well, how come he wasn't at the IDF in the 70s? What was he doing and other stuff? And we did talk about. And actually, we figured out the global awareness seminars that IDF did. Joe figures he was at least one of those, one on China.
One of the earlier ones.
So we're trying, and so as we hit the mid 80s, well, if Naaman were here, Naaman was very involved in Sanctuary. I came in the tail end. Ron came in, but we're going to start hitting the phase where at least Joe and I start to come in more into the picture, at least by the end of this one. Even before. So
Somebody ask a question and we'll begin there.
Well, so I mean,
Where do you want to start?
Okay, well, so I think, we had just touched on it briefly, and we probably can go over that again. So IDF made the decision. We kind of talked about the board mechanics and how there was a lot of discussion. It had to come out unanimous. It went on for a long time, but the board decided to support public sanctuary. And the first refugees were known as Davida Neva Vargas, came here in 84. So I guess my question would be, how did sanctuary change the IDF? How did public sanctuary change the IDF? How did IDF work with Quakos? How did all these things start to happen, and what was going on? Is that good enough, or is that way
Yeah.
too broad?
No, that's fine. Well, the change factor was in and 8. That is, the change was not, it wasn't accidental. I think it was in '79, presented a proposal to the board about the conflict that was beginning to develop between the PCC and the IDF. And I think I shared with Martine a copy of the thing that I wrote at that time. So that was kind of the beginning of making a transition from kind of a reform organization to something beyond it. What the beyond was, no one knew. But I was hoping that we could move beyond reform kind of status. And the Global Awareness Seminars became an educational tool or an ideological tool for bringing about some mental changes. And especially the one on China, the one on South Africa, and the one on Latin America. And I say that those had an impact because we were writing grants for those programs, and we were getting the most money for them from the Colvin Fund. And it was granting us $5,000 for each one, and the IDF board was granting another $5,000. So we had a $10,000 budget to work those things. But once the Latin American Liberation Theology seminar was carried off, Colvin would not touch it anymore. So I think that was a indication that that was an effective ideological tool for bringing about some change. I also proposed in '81 that we start the resource library, the Peace Resource Library. And we had modeled that on comments that or conversation I had with Bishop Tutu when he was here in the United States that year. And so he was telling me about the role that such libraries played in the struggle in South Africa for the African Congress. So that seemed interesting to me, and that it might have something to offer here. So I proposed it, and the board bought it, and that's when the Peace with Justice priority was established as a result of that action.
So at that point, the co-op is around
Mm-hmm.
and functioning. The UCF stuff is pretty much is all done at this point. The Neighborhood Watch is over or still going?
Yeah. Neighborhood Service Ministry continued up until '83.
To 83, okay. Radical readings were happening. What were they called at that point? Was that
Radical readings.
Radical?
That's what
Okay.
they were called.
Radical readings. Okay.
So that was kind of, on that front, doing some educational or cultural action stuff. I had begun attending the PACA meetings.
People's Alliance on Central America.
Yeah. Because, well, the food co-op was a strong advocate or support structure at this point. And there were quite a few PACA folk who were members of the food co-op. So that was some cross-fertilization going on.
Like Scott Peters, or?
No, I don't think Scott was in at that part. He came in a little bit later. Yeah, he was about a year or two later, I guess. So I started going to the PACA meetings because that seemed like a resource. And Eric Dell, who was the campus pastor over at the Community United Church, was also a member of the food co-op, and his brother Dan Dale, was one of the National Sanctuary organizers. And so Eric and I had been sharing ideas about trying to get something going with regard to Central America. and his brother Dan was urging us on. So we decided together on a trip to Arthur to pick up cheese for the food co-op that we would try to get a group of folk together who would be interested in talking at least about starting a public sanctuary site for Salvadorans and Guatemalans here. I forget the dates, but I think that was like in August or early September when we had that conversation. And we agreed that we'd meet back together in October to see where we were. And in that time, we had made contact with all the clergy in town, inviting them to a meeting in November. I'd also talked to Steve Lodwig, who was a member of IDF, but also a member of PACA.
And the church mouse.
And the church mouse. To see if PACA would be interested in this, and so he was, but he wanted to hear what the clergy had to say. Well, Eric and I got together again in October, and there was some interest, but not real gung-ho interest. Steve offered us the access through PACA, a meeting room in the Illini Union for a meeting in December. If we could get these people who seemed to be interested to make a commitment to attend that meeting. So we tried that, and the three clergy showed up, Father Tom Royer, Eric, and myself. None of the others. There were like probably 100 to 200 people we had invited to it. So, interestingly enough, Steve was not disappointed by that. He in fact sort of anticipated it, I think. So he was way ahead of us in terms of evaluating the clergy status in town. So he urged us to keep on going, and Father Royer said, okay, let's use St. Mary's and see if we can get some folks. So we had another meeting in January, another one in February, March, April, May, and the group grew to about 30 folk, both clergy, nuns, and some Roman laity, and some lay folk from other congregations. But we weren't getting anywhere, we were just talking around the issue. So I proposed that we all go back to our separate units, struggle for a commitment by the end of August. We meet in early September with what we found out.
This is 1983 right now, correct?
Fall of 82, yeah, 83. Fall of 83, move into 80. No, fall of 82, 83. So in our meetings here, we had University Place Church's staff, its church and society, members of its department, and about half of the board, IDF board, attending these meetings. And gradually, it seemed like we were ready to make a decision. So we planned a 3-day retreat, which would be held in the chapel, in which all members of the board would be present for a very intensive ideological discussion of the issues. And we brought in refugees, national organizers, people from the border, some folk from Mexico, and others like Belden Fields and some other pocket people. And it was a very intense discussion, but everybody was in favor of moving to the next phase, which was an IDF board meeting to make a decision. So that got set up in September. And first decision was that whatever decision we would make had to be unanimous. So it took us 3 days, not continuous days, but 8 hours over the 3 days to reach a decision, and it was finally unanimous. We had one board member resign right after that, because her husband ran a construction company and received federal money, so she was afraid that her connection to that sanctuary would affect his federal money. So she removed herself. It didn't seem like that was a conflict of interest for her personally, but it was a family conflict of interest, so she removed herself. We got back together with all of the other folk, and no one had made any moves whatsoever, the other churches. Part of the board's decision was we would offer the building as the site for public sanctuary, provided that there were two other groups that would join us in being sponsors. Community church came on next. Then I think it was the Friends, and then McKinley, and then St. Mary's. St. Mary's was the last because they had three political processes that they had to go through before they could arrive at a consensus. So it took them longer than the rest of us, but they agreed in January of '84.
Can you tell us how many, I guess, units were represented when the discussion started?
You mean churches?
Yeah.
Church units? I really don't remember, but I would guess 20. It seemed like quite a few. Most of them were like the Church of the Brethren. The Church of the Brethren was one. The Mennonite Church was one.
And why did they not come on board? It was because they couldn't get their denominate or couldn't get their parishioners to support it, or
they just never showed up to report. The two New Covenant Fellowship congregations. I don't remember.
Campus Crusade for Christ?
No, they never showed up. St. Pat's was one. A couple of Lutheran churches.
Newman?
No. Although I tried to get Father Newman Duncan to show up, but that was a funny experience. But there were quite a few at the beginning who were interested. The first meeting was down in Weisgarver, and it was, like, there was probably 75 people there. But it boiled down to 5. Well, in January, the national gathering was called. Tucson arranged for that, so that's when Frankie and I went down, Frankie Day. And I've already told you that story.
Mm-hmm.
So we came back and reported what was going on. We had made contact already with with attorneys who said they would serve us. They met with us. There was a large meeting held in what is now the PRC room, and there was a standing room only in that room. It was a bad room to hold it, and we should have held it in Weisgarver. But we weren't sure how many people would show up. A whole bunch did. And the lawyers wanted us to, the 5 co-sponsoring units, to create a chain of command, so that if anyone, their view was that the leaders of those 5 co-sponsoring units would be the ones that the feds would hit. And so they wanted a line of command established so that they would know who they were to defend at what time.
Who were the lawyers?
Brian Savage, Betsy Wong, and the 2 McGraths. So we established a chain of command. I was top dog. Charlie Schweitzer was next.
From McKinley.
Frankie Day was next. Tom Arroyo was next. And Ron Beebe, I believe, was last.
So the idea was as people
If I got knocked off,
hit, then they would just move down from it. Okay.
But that was information that only the attorneys had.
What if the attorneys got knocked off? What was their chain of command?
The one who probably would have actually acted would have been Brian. And what would have happened if he'd got knocked off, I don't know. The others were kind of wishy-washy, especially McGrath. They were always anxious for every I to be dotted and every T crossed. But they were good because they knew what I's needed to be dotted and what T's needed to be crossed. Brian wasn't so concerned about such matters. In fact, I think
Fiddly things, you know.
I think he was hoping that we
Details.
would be arrested.
So he could videotape it.
Yeah, or whatever. But he was the most gung-ho. So then we had to get organized, and so we put out a call for monitors. We wanted 24-hour watch with 2 monitors for each 8-hour term. And then we had to fix the apartment upstairs, so we got that done. There was going to be need for medical attention, so we recruited some doctors. No hospital was available for servicing, so we had to use Francis Nelson's back door into Mercy Hospital, Provena now. Provena was, Mercy was open to Francis Nelson's staff, as long as they didn't know too much. And the doctors at the at Francis Nelson wasn't willing to tell too much, so it worked out well. There were several dentists who were ready to help.
So David and Eva came in May of '84?
Yeah, May 13th. They actually arrived 3 days early, but no one knew that except I think Frankie and I.
And they had been out of El Salvador for a while and were in transit?
Yeah, she had been a social worker and working in some of the villages, and that put her in contact with the guerrilla movement. And so she was marked as a person who should be arrested, and somehow she found out about that, so she took off walking her way through El Salvador into Mexico and on up to Tucson, crossing the border.
With her husband or with?
No, they'd never met at that point.
Oh.
He was working for a government agency, an agricultural agency, and also working with the farming rural community. And his father was kind of like a local judge in a small village, and was close, apparently had close ties to the FMLN, and had been arrested. And David had been arrested. David had been tortured and I guess was headed for execution, but had been able to escape with the help of the head of the agricultural department that he was working for, who hid him out in his offices for a while until he could get a plane, and then flew David out to San Diego. In the meantime, Eva had made her way through the sanctuary network to San Francisco, as had David, and that's where they met and got married.
Now, at this point in the larger sanctuary movement, that was its infancy pretty much. So,
Yes.
so them hearing about this was something brand new. I mean, that their contacts were able to get them out was a new thing.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the national gathering was the first time that people came together to try to form a sanctuary movement.
So in the space of about 5 months, this all came together then?
Yeah, they only gave us 3 months to do it. So in April, late April, we first had to organize regions. And we divided the country up into 7 regions arbitrarily. Well, not totally arbitrary, because there were already way stations all around. For example, there was a big one in Chicago. There were lots of congregations in Chicago that were already housing Central American refugees. There are 2 kinds of refugees. There's first asylum refugees, which are political refugees, and then there are immigrants, economic immigrants. So we were dealing with asylum immigrants first, asylum immigrants.
No, when IDF became a public sanctuary, at that point, how many other public sanctuaries existed around the country?
We were the 105th one.
105. But that was all in a space of a year or two, that from
Yeah.
1 to 105?
Yeah, the first sanctuary started in '81 in Tucson. And by word of mouth, others began to develop. But the press was on. And this, like by the time we came online, there were close to 1 million undocumented Salvadorians alone in the network.
So 105, so at its peak, the sanctuary movement, how big did it get? So if IDF was 105.
There were a little over 500 public sanctuary sites. So, well, we got the 7 regions established, and that meant that those sanctuary units in those 7 regions had to meet. So that meant getting them together to meet, which was like pulling teeth. Without Novocaine. And then we had to get them to elect representatives or people to participate in a national gathering. And we had to find funding so that all the refugees wanted to get together. So we had to find funding to get the refugees all together. And finally we got it all done. It was haphazard as all get out, but it got done.
So how did your job change once people were actually living here, and were you dealing with sanctuary related stuff 28 hours a day?
Pretty much. Because I was wearing 2 hats, head of the local unit and working with the national. Yeah, I was able to pretty much continue to maintain the food co-op for another 2 or 3 years, and relying heavily on its leadership, which had been very much committed. The food co-op, as soon as we voted for becoming public a sanctuary, the food co-op held a massive meeting, general meeting, and voted to be supportive of it and to provide all the food support stuff and a lot of the monitors for the refugees.
Wow, how times have changed.
So they were into it in a big way, but that was also...
Because the monitors were in what's now the PRC office, but it used to
Right.
be the food co-op office, then the food co-op Quakos office.
So, yeah, that's... well, and the tension also showed up in Quakos. I probably overplayed, looking back on it, overplayed the chain of command too hard, because, for example, the Friends are heavily into consensus stuff. And Dorothy and Frankie and one other woman, what was her name? She was a real weird one. Bobby was her first name, I don't remember.
Bobby Watson Woodard or Bobby Woodard?
She's a strange one.
Yeah, she's still around now.
So they had to reach consensus among themselves, and then they had to
Wait,
take
Bobby Trist?
Trist,
Yeah. I knew I'd get a rise out of Joe once I figured it
Yeah.
out.
That's familiar.
And then they had to go to the Friends meeting and get them to sort of agree, and they never could get them to agree.
Had Dorothy already been to the Philippines at this point and back?
Yeah,
Was this-
yeah, she was a basket case herself, because she'd been in
I thought she
prison.
went later.
She went later too.
Oh, so this,
but
when
this
I
is-
saw her leave, that was the second trip?
Yeah.
She was, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, she had been captured and, like one evening watch, we took turns leading evening watch and.
That evening watch was.
Evening watch, it was, it served two purposes. One, it was to help nurture the core of Quakos in maintaining their commitment. In a theological way. We chose the.
It was separate from the monitoring. It wasn't
Right,
necessarily.
right. But anybody could come. I mean, it wasn't a private kind of thing. It wasn't exclusive. But it was held at 11 o'clock, the last canonical hour, and it would run until we all either passed out or
Every night?
every night. So usually it would run till around 3 o'clock in the morning. We were helped mightily by large bottles of wine. Anyway, it was Dorothy's turn to lead this, and she went into a catatonic state. She just folded up into a little ball, and we all waited for her to do something, but she didn't. And everybody remained silent for probably about 20 minutes. And
It's a Quaker thing.
yeah, so finally, I said, well, let's move on and see what we can do. Maybe Dorothy will return, and in about an hour she did. So she was a basket case. It was about a year before. Well, we first tried to get therapy going for her, but no way. She was highly suspicious of therapists here in the country. So, but anyway, she was willing to meet with 2 or 3 of us, and we would spend maybe 2 or 3 hours every Saturday up in McBride Hall, just talking, whatever seemed to be she wanted to talk about. And gradually she came out of it. Plus I got her to writing novels and poetry about her experience in the Philippines, which she was willing to do.
So the IDF was, since there were monitors here 24 hours a day, right? So things were pretty chaotic.
Well, no, it was working, and it was orderly. We had crises. One of the first crises, I guess, that we had was we were in what's now the PRC room, and David was meeting with a small group of folk over something, and a black Ford escort pulled in and parked. He saw it and he bolted out of the room. And he just completely disappeared. We went all over the building looking for him. And at that time, there was nothing over there on the other side of the street except a big field full of high grass.
And strawberry fields eventually, if you went far
And
enough.
strawberry fields far over. So I thought, well, he's not in the building, so I'll just start looking in the neighborhood. And I found him buried up in that high grass out in that field. And black Ford escorts were used by death squads in El Salvador, and that's what he saw when it pulled into the parking lot, and he bolted. There were times when he was able to get a job with a construction company, and the construction company owner found out that he was an undocumented person and refused to pay him, although insisting that he continue to work, or he would turn him in. So we had to go deal with that guy. We had some women who were related to McKinley who thought, well, we'll take advantage of this and get a free babysitter. So they were hiring Ava to be their babysitter and refusing to pay her. So we had to deal with that.
Plus, were they both publicly speaking on it at this point, or was
Oh,
it
yeah.
mostly David?
Yeah,
It was-
no, they were both speaking. They would always speak with their masks on, because what we'd found out in other cases was when undocumented political asylum refugees spoke with it and became identified, then his or her family back in El Salvador or Guatemala would be arrested and maybe even disappeared. So David and Eva had been warned through the network to always wear their masks. That was a bit of a public problem because, especially with the News Gazette and reporters for the television stations, because they didn't want to deal with anybody who wore a mask. So,
not like Lone Ranger masks. They wore bandanas. Right?
Well, yeah. I've got some pictures of them.
I think it was like the Illinois Times, one of those papers had a picture of the
Right.
two of you,
Right.
two of them and you,
Right.
and like in front of the IDF sign or something.
Right, that was like maybe 2 or 3 days after they got here. So there were those kinds of crises. Then we had, Ava was pregnant, and then we had to deal with how to, we got them into St. Mary's through Francis Nelson. The baby was born, but then how do you get a baby registered in the courthouse without having the parents identified? And so Brian was very helpful at manipulating those kinds of things. So
I don't think I realized that Brian was so involved at that point.
Well,
Was it through the nuclear free stuff that you guys knew about Brian, or how?
well, of course, that and the apartheid stuff.
Well, that apartheid stuff didn't.
Brian was involved.
No, I know he was, but I guess that was happening around the same time.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, all of this stuff was going on. This was a little bit before, but we had 2 big demonstrations against Reagan. Reagan appeared at Eureka College, and we pulled together a demonstration for that. And then he came from the Republican Party, and they had a big meeting out at the Round Barn.
I remember that.
Demonstration for that. So all of that was going on too. And later was the homeless thing, and we had that going on.
Well, I'm gonna do a sidebar like Joe did last time, trying to figure out where I was or
Yeah,
where I came in the picture. So I came here in the fall of '84, and I had a Spanish class with Robin Cohen, if you remember her. I mean, I think she was a Paca Cuecos person, and she saw me as somebody to push. So I think that November or December I saw David speak at McKinley Church, and I got involved as a monitor. So I think by the beginning of '85, or maybe by the end of '84, I was doing a shift once a week in there. And I remember meeting a theological potpourri. It was like you, Kay Bridgeford, who was Unitarian at that point, and then Dorothy, who was a Quaker. So I met because Dorothy was often doing the overnight shift, and she would often relieve me because I was doing the evening shift. She slept there a lot in the office. We had a little fold-out couch thing. So that was my first encounter with the foundation, was sitting in that office. And then I think I joined the food co-op soon afterwards, even though I still lived in the dorms.
Yeah. And
The co-op didn't suck back then. On the record.
I think it's a three-drawer filing cabinet. Maybe it's 2-drawer. Last time I saw it was up in McBride, and it's one of those cardboard things, not a metal filing cabinet. But in that is all the old official Quaco stuff, and there's the monitor books.
But I remember it was a pretty organized thing, because there was a lot of people to get 24 hours a day, even though there was like a nighttime shift, but to get people to be in the office. And if something really had gone down, I'm not sure I would have been able to deal with it. I know there was the phone, they were supposed to call.
No, there was the phone trade.
Where were the monitors at?
We just sat in where the PRC desk is now.
Yeah.
We just sat at the desk, and the theory was that if the FBI came in through the front door so you could see them, or if anything suspicious happened, that you were supposed to set off the phone tree and let people know. Because the fear was, well, I mean, it was happening that sanctuary units were being busted. So this way, if they got, you know, we found out anything that happened, we're supposed to initiate the phone tree. And
Well, the phone tree, there
Yep.
were 4 emergency teams. There were 2 places that refugees, undocumented refugees would be taken. One is to the courthouse, federal courthouse in Danville at that time. There was no federal courthouse here. So they'd go to Danville or they would go to Chicago. So we had 2 teams. If the phone tree got initiated, those 4 teams would take off for their appointed places with the money necessarily to bail people out. Or bribe whoever they had to bribe to get them out. And they were to be there before the refugees got to those holding places. So
Yeah, because probably once they were in the system, then
that's right.
you never know where they were.
And we had an agreement with People's Law Office in Chicago. They also were part of the country that they would be notified if they were to get to the office or the courthouse there in Chicago. And we had a lawyer, an attorney over in Danville also who was willing to do that. So that was one thing that kicked off. Another one was that each of the 5 co-sponsoring units had already recruited people from their separate units for a mass rally. And they were to be here within 30 minutes of the initial call. And we would gather in the junction out there right in Springfield, stopping traffic, being arrested, whatever we had to do to draw public attention to what was going on.
around, I mean, I know Paco was really large at this point, and that's also the anti-apartheid movement was starting up. So there was a lot of activity, and I also remember the Pledge of Resistance,
Right.
which was kind of similar to that, which was people would sign, which would say if the U.S. invaded, was it just El Salvador or was it all of Central America? I can't remember.
Nicaragua.
If the U.S. did an
Nicaragua was under pressure.
overt invasion, you agreed to do civil disobedience. Yeah, so I think it was the whole region. So I remember signing the Pledge of Resistance outside Allen Hall by Greg Swenson, the guy who did the Romero thing. He got me to sign it, so I signed saying yes, I'll get arrested.
And the goal was to have 5,000 people in the intersection.
Was that, just out of curiosity, Grenada had happened the fall before this, in '83, you know, was, so this stuff wasn't in operation at that point, right? So there was no.
I don't think the Pledge of Resistance came till after. I mean, the Pledge of Resistance wasn't exactly.
It was a little later.
Yeah,
But it was
Grenada was a surprise for. I mean, I was back in this country at that point, but you know, Grenada, nobody really expected that to happen.
And nobody really protested
Took
it too
people off.
largely because
Yeah,
it wasn't.
The Pledge of Resistance, as I remember it, was really started by Sojourners, the Washington D.C. outfit. And it came on a little later. Christic Institute was in pretty early. They were the ones who were watchdogging Reagan in the Iran-Contra.
They were the Iran-Contra people right there.
And were the ones who broke that story.
Well, I remember
So
CISPAS
we were
being,
all interrelated in some way.
and CISPAS was huge. The Committee in Solidarity with
right,
People of
right,
El Salvador
right.
was national.
Right.
'Cause they were, and so Paco was part of that, though not solely
And
part
America's
of that.
Watch and Amnesty International was for bodies involved.
I mean, I guess just the thing that there was so much activity going on around Central America and solidarity stuff. That wasn't all just one thing.
Yeah. I forgot about Amnesty, and that's where we got Francis Boyle involved in civil resistance theory. And he was willing to play that role for us. So yeah, it was an interesting conglomeration coalition thing that was coming together, and there was no way to figure it out. You went with your gut and hoped that you didn't make too many mistakes.
I do remember the food co-op thing because like Dee Castillo was one of the big Quakos people, but she was also in the food co-op, and then Brenda and Nancy and all those people. Everybody seemed to be involved in all of this stuff, at least at that point, from my impression.
And so IDF was the only place that was actually housing refugees was in town, right? Okay.
And then Ava did the postcards, right?
Oh, she did lots of things. It was not just postcards. She did the postcards, yeah, but she also painted pictures. And when you got hanging in the office,
Did you bring any of the postcards with you?
No, but I got.
We probably still
I got
have
some,
baggies of them somewhere in there.
a photograph of one of her paintings.
It was one of the fundraising things that Ava did was to raise money was these nice little beautiful postcards
Mhm.
that I remember we were all supposed to sell as part of our like fundraising activities.
Fundraising activities.
I think I had a stack of them that I never sold.
And we raised quite a lot of money with it. I've still got some, and I still use them at Christmas time. Well, anyway, what was that?
What was the, you know, so you've got the refugees here. What was the immediate response, you know, in the community when this became public? You know, what?
Well,
I mean, churches as well as outside.
right,
I mean,
right.
just generally.
And shortly after Frank and I got back from Tucson in January of '84, the editor of the News Gazoo called and wanted to get together. It was a woman, and I knew her for a number of years, and she had been pretty helpful in reporting things and covering events. But she wanted to talk, and usually it was me calling her, but this time she called me. Some big meeting had occurred in Chicago in which all the publishers of newspapers in the state of Illinois had been held, and owners had insisted that no coverage of the sanctuary movement take place. And so she had come to tell me that that was the policy of the News Gazoo. So that was the first reaction.
DI covered stuff though.
DI did, yeah. The DI was not under its present control factors. So it was free to do whatever it wanted to do, and it did a fairly decent job.
They used to have reporters back then.
Yeah, they did. The next response was from Uniplace, and also over at McKinley Church. McKinley Foundation and McKinley Church were two separate entities at that time. And also at Community United Church. The foundation there and the church were two separate things. And Ron Beebe, who was the pastor at that point, he had apparently signed UCC on as a co-sponsoring without processing it properly in the congregation.
Wasn't that one of the mandates though that?
Well, yes, but you know, he didn't do it. Or at least that was the story. And he was booted out after about a year. Now, before we had gone into our own decision about it, the staff of Uniplace and their church and society people had all participated in this ideological thing we had done earlier. And they were gung-ho for it. And they presented a resolution to the congregation and a series of educational programs every month.
They were gung-ho, why? Because they didn't understand it?
Largely because everybody who was on that committee was also on the IDEA board.
Okay.
And also, well, the fact is that almost every key person in the church structure was a member of the IDEA board. At that time, we had infiltrated the decision-making structures pretty well.
As opposed to them infiltrating.
Right. But then the real power structure began to function inside Uniplace, and this was composed of presidents and vice presidents of local banks and loan companies, and real estate people.
And this
insurance.
is after the reality of what was really
Right,
happening.
right.
It was no longer discussion.
And so they began to play their role pretty much, I think, behind the scenes. So that when the congregation finally voted in May of '84, there were 3 votes. One was to denounce the sanctuary movement. 2 was to denounce the foundation. And the third was, since the 1908 conspiracy law, is that right?
Do you know what?
Early part of the last century. Anyway.
Sedition.
The treasurer of the board, church board, remembered the conspiracy law whenever it was passed.
Yeah.
It had to be in the early part of the 1900s, as a part of World War I.
Oh, the 1917.
1917,
Yeah,
okay.
the Sedition Act, yeah.
So he remembered that and brought it up, and he says, you know, we're even having this discussion, we're breaking that federal law. So I move that we expunge this, all record of this discussion.
This was right before David Neva came?
Yes, about
Okay.
1 week before. So that was their third vote. So what shows up in their minutes is that the Church and Society Department presented their report, and the report was received.
So there's no record.
No record.
So,
I was wondering if somebody now wanted to sort of talk with some of the people involved in that discussion, are there any around that you know?
The moderator, the person who was moderator, Amaker, Mrs. Amaker.
Joanne? Joanne?
Joanne.
Was Clyde in multiple, was he in both positions at that point, or was he not as high in the church at that point?
Clyde had been surfaced as a communist back in the 60s, because he had headed up the local organizing for the teachers union at Central High School. And at one church board meeting, I forget what, the issue was Project Equality. We were dealing with anti-racism possibilities. And, one of the church board people said, well, we got to remember, Clyde was presenting the resolution for Project Equality. And one of the board members said, well, we got to remember that Clyde is one of the organizers of the local teachers union, and we know what they are. They won't even allow anybody to pledge allegiance in the classroom because they're communists.
Either Clyde's changed a lot, or they were really off base.
Well,
I'm guessing that they were off base.
They were off base. I don't know if Clyde's position has changed or not, but it came as a real surprise to Clyde to be called out like that. I remember he was really devastated by that. Where were we?
Now, was he a part of this?
No, because I was asking, because
Yeah.
Martine asked who was part of the power structure that made.
Yeah,
some
Clyde
of this-
was a part of that board meeting.
Part of the church board meeting?
Church board meeting.
Okay.
He was also on the foundation board, which also made him suspect. Who else was here? Catherine Wright would have been here, but she I don't think is longer. She lives out in Homer someplace, so I don't think she's even active anymore. Most of the people who were on our side left Uni Place shortly, about the same time I did. It could have been 85 or 86.
So I guess that leads us to the big fallout.
With the congregation.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so the first step was this vote that they took.
Oh, yeah.
And then,
Well, at that time, the congregation had all of its Sunday school classes up on the foundation third floor that were below the middle school level. And the next thing we knew was that all of those classes on a Sunday morning disappeared.
that's probably a good thing. That probably wasn't very secure, was it? I wouldn't trust those little fuckers.
Probably not. But they all disappeared. And so
Whoops.
I went to church authorities
Strike
and said, you know what's going on? There's nothing going on. There's nobody up there. And the refugees had befriended some people as they were going to class, some little kids or whatever. So they were wondering too, was that being up there on the third floor all by your lonesome isn't pleasant either.
So the church mouse was still there. Steve was still there.
You know, Steve left, he graduated in
What was it?
May of
Was it
84.
Morgan? Paul Morgan was
Paul
up?
Morgan was next.
But so he was living there, and then they had an apartment that was in the front over, but it was larger than any of the small rooms because we
Right.
divided those rooms up, right? So they had.
They had basically 2 rooms plus the kitchen. So what we found out was that Sandy Moyer, who was the staff person at UPCC in charge of Christian education, told me that the parents of those children didn't wish their kids to be associated with those refugees. So they had moved the classes out.
And this was within a few months of them living up there.
Yeah, it was almost, Sunday schools started in those days in September, so I would guess that probably by October it was vacated.
Can you hold that thought for a minute, Jim?
Sure.
Might take a little break.
Back to we're progressing or charting the disintegration of the UPCC IDF relationship post sanctuary. So they pulled all the Sunday school classes. They passed secret resolutions. They pulled all the Sunday school classes.
The next thing that happened was David and Eva, their goal was to be present in each one of the 5 co-sponsoring units' worship services. They were never clear about the difference between IDF and UPCC, because I suppose because of the building. We tried to make that clear to them many times, but it never seemed to sink in. So they decided one Sunday to go to church service at UPCC, and I don't know who the translator was who went with them. But anyway, there was a translator with them. And as they went down this hall and entered into the sanctuary proper, they encountered 3 individuals who refused them entrance. These later we identified as elders of the congregation. That's an office elder, the elder office. And we know who those 3 guys were. So they denied them entrance. And as David and Eva left, come back down the hallway, they overheard one of the guys say, "I guess we showed those commies." So.
Did they know they were coming? Is that how they were able to block them, or did
I don't think so.
they just were prepared for this eventually happening?
Since it was David and Eva's own initiative to make that journey, I don't think there was any leakage.
So you're leaving those names off the record? Is that what you were?
Who?
The elders?
3.
Well, there's
Yep.
they're all dead now, so making a difference. And my mother told me never speak ill of the dead. So all I can say is that they're dead good. So that pretty much ended it.
And so this went, you've heard about it pretty quickly after that?
Yeah, it was probably a week or 2 before they got up enough nerve to tell me. But I met with Roger Jenks, who was the pastor by that time, and told him what happened then.
So was this late 84 or early 85?
I wrote the letter that I wrote, so I'll find the date. I think it's 85, maybe it's 86. And his response was, "Well, I can't control the behavior of my elders." And I responded by, "Well, that's true, but you can certainly discipline the eldership so that this doesn't happen again, because this is a violation of disciple tradition, and it's a worse sign." So he wanted me to put it in writing, so I did, and gave it to him, or placed it in his mailbox. Never heard back. Talked to the chairman of the elders. They never heard of it. Made that approach 3 different times over 3 different years. Nothing was ever come of it. But anyway, I left. I notified the church board that I wasn't going to attend anymore. I was not going to meet their expectations. And the foundation board said, Jim, why don't you just stop going to those meetings? So I did. So that was the end of it, of the connection.
So this was by 86 or so, or by
Yeah.
87 it was?
Well, it was before 87.
47, okay.
That's what yeah, 85.
85.
So, can I ask you, so by that time, had the, the administrative of the foundation been transferred already, or was that in the process?
They were still running it. Jackie Sturdivant was still doing it.
Oh, the administration stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jackie Sturdivant she was an administrative secretary. And part of the job that she applied for and was hired for was to do the administrative work for the foundation. At that point, the two we had a joint personnel committee, and the joint personnel committee had written her job description, so she was working for us, which put her in a bind. The split, and she for a while continued to share information with me about things that were going on.
Now, did she have an office on this side, or was she?
No,
over there?
Her office was there.
Okay.
And so did Catherine Wright, who was the bookkeeper for both organizations. So we could rely on information coming from them. But things began to get so heated on Uniplace's side that they had, if they were going to maintain their jobs, they had to shut up. So, and that was fair. So.
And
Okay.
Judith Brownfeld was still on staff for the foundation at this point too. Yes, no?
No.
No?
She, as we were moving towards the decision for sanctuary, she began to voice concerns about she needed the foundation to provide her with protection from federal prosecution. And as those conversations became more frantic, that is, none of the attorneys could figure out a way to offer her any kind of protection. And indeed, she already knew more than she should have known. And her husband, who was allegedly a survivor of the Holocaust, was putting pressure on her that, as she reported it to me, was that he had already paid his dues and he didn't want to go through that again. So, and she didn't want to lose her job. So we concocted a scheme. We would continue to pay her her salary for 6 months. She could stop working for us and go find another job while we continued to pay her. It took a while for her to figure that out, what that meant. About a month, I guess. So finally she found a job over at McKinley and went over there. And we continued to pay her for the continued 6 months. So that's how we terminated that relationship.
So to follow up kind of where Martine was going, so pretty much, not to jump ahead, usually we're jumping back, not to jump ahead, between say 84 when David and Neva came to 90 was a period of major, some quicker, some gradual deterioration between the IDF-UPCC relationship.
Yeah,
correct and correct?
yeah, yeah,
Okay. So some of it took weeks, some of it took years.
yeah. It wasn't just that relationship though. Roger, for example, Roger preached a sermon one Sunday, I forget what year it was, in which it was on family values, I gather, and in the sermon he was alleged to have said it was the woman's place to stay at home, to have babies, and to take care of her husband, and that there was no place in the church for lesbians. Well, the congregation at that time had about 30 folk who were lesbian. So that afternoon, the afternoon in which he preached that sermon, and I had been earlier helpful in getting that group started. So I began getting phone calls. And these people wanted to know, what could I do? Well, there wasn't anything I could do. So they all piped up and left. There were quite a few moderate liberal folk who also heard that sermon and who also left.
Now, did they leave publicly? I mean, did they leave with a, slamming of the door, or did they basically just not show up anymore?
Basically, they did. Now the lesbian group, they slammed some doors, but moderate liberals, they just faded away. Most of them joined different Presbyterian churches, Green Street, Presbyterian McKinley, and the Presbyterian Church in Champaign.
So it wasn't just the fact that IDF was moving more to the left, UPCC was moving more to the right.
Right.
So it wasn't just, so it was kind of a double thing going on there.
Right. Right.
And Sanctuary was maybe a wedge, but not the only wedge.
Right.
Kind of goes along with what was happening in the country overall, right?
Mhm.
I mean, there was this gradual,
Mhm.
under the Reagan period.
And then another factor was, as these people left, they stopped paying money into UPC's coffers. And so there was economic pressure beginning to be exerted on. They had a very heavy, they had 5 or 6 full-time staff people. And at this point, things began to come down on Jackie and Catherine about, we can't have you continue to serve IDF booking. We need you to do our books all the time. We need you to do the office work for UPC all the time. So sometime, I forget what year, 89 or 90, I'll try to pull that stuff together if I can find it all, where those negotiations started about UPC cutting off the
Wow,
administrative.
I was on staff at that point.
Yeah. So that was 89 or 90, somewhere in there. So that relationship just went on down.
So where was discipledom as a whole going in the late 80s to 90? Was UPCC reflective of a general trend in discipledom, or was it at the cutting edge of moving to the right?
Well, going back to the Civil War.
That major shift.
The disciples could not make up their mind on whose side they were on during the Civil War. And the reason was that disciples, tradition was that, we've covered all this stuff. The Anabaptist thing is, we don't take orders from the government. And we don't take orders from hierarchical authorities. So that means that leadership in either one of those camps find it very difficult to move an Anabaptist unit through its position. And a part of that is, the Anabaptist viewpoint is that there's only one sovereign, and that's God. And God is against war. So this civil war cannot be good. We are not going to join it. That did not stop disciples from serving both in the Confederate Army and the Yankee Army. But they were not blessed. And there were a lot of people who, while there wasn't such a thing as conscientious objection at that time, who fled. They went west, which helped open up the frontier and killed Indians. And that's pretty much, I think, what happened among disciples also during the 80s. And I say that because Harvey Lord up at University Church in Chicago had convinced University Church to become a public sanctuary there. Kenneth Kennan down in Tucson had helped convince the First Christian Church in Tucson to become a sanctuary unit. And I forget the guy's name out at Berkeley. He had conned a disciple church there to become a sanctuary. And the four of us worked together creating a resolution to be presented to the denomination at its General Assembly in Iowa City.
What year was this, Jim?
86, 87, somewhere in there. To go online as a support of public sanctuary and to lobby the U.S. government for political refugees from Central America. So we got our resolution done, and so then the problem was, okay, how do we process it? So I got the job of calling the general minister and president of the denomination and saying, okay, Kenneth T-Card, we have this resolution, what do we do? And he says, well, I haven't even heard of the sanctuary movement. And I said, well, that can't be, because I've been sending you the voice for at least a year, and it's carried information about it. Harvey Lord has been sending you information from his church, and these others have too, and you haven't heard this? Well, no, it hasn't come across my desk. So somebody in the underlings of the general minister's office was the bottleneck, or Kenneth was lying. I don't think Kenneth was lying, because he was, during the 50s, was chairman of the Arkansas Council for Religious Equality during the Little Rock integration issue. And that was my first contact with him, and he certainly held firm during that period. But he was pleading ignorance, so I sent him all these details and stuff, and he processed it through and argued for it, unlike Mr. Ham when we took the boycott stuff to the general board. Processed it through, and it came out as a resolution to the General Assembly, and it passed. David and Ava went and made their presentation. We had maybe, I would guess we had pretty close to 40 people from Champaign-Urbana. They're lined up in they have microphones all over the General Assembly floor. And some are for resolutions, and the other mics are against the resolutions. So all our people lined up at these mics, and we had a line that went from the front of the Assembly Hall over halfway back. So we had a bunch of people there to talk, and it passed overwhelmingly. So the denomination at that point went online as a supporter of the sanctuary. But the General Assembly, this gets back into our polity stuff. The General Assembly is like a local congregation, except it's a national congregation.
So it can't enforce anything.
So it can't, it cannot, it does not empower anybody to do anything. It's just speaking for that congregation existing at the national level for about 5 days. And then when it's over, the congregation no longer exists. But the advantage of those resolutions, and this you need to keep in mind, is that it influences people. And it also sanctions those people who will take the initiative to act on those resolutions. And so you can then appeal to it and say, this is our justification for doing this. So,
But congregations get to just ignore it.
yeah, if they choose to.
Right.
But that opens the door for us then, which we use to say, okay, to say Danville Central Christian Church, the Assembly has passed this resolution, we'd like to come and tell you about Quakos, what we're doing, so that they'll understand, your congregation will understand. And so we got invitations. The pastor never supported us on it, but he would let us in the door. Kankakee, well, another way of gauging it is how many disciple churches invited us to make these speeches. There was Danville. There was Kankakee. There was Terre Haute. There was Lexington, Kentucky. There was Hot Springs, Arkansas. That was it.
Out of how many in the region?
Well, these were,
Yeah.
I mean, that's throughout the country.
Oh, okay, throughout the country, okay. So obviously UPCC never invited you to give a presentation.
No.
In the region alone, it's like 150 or 60.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
And I don't think Hot Springs is in our region.
Yeah, no, that's,
Neither is Lexington, Kentucky or
yeah.
Terre Haute.
It's on the edge, right?
Well, Terre Haute's close.
Excuse me, Taylorsville,
Ah.
in central Illinois.
Did any of them actually support?
Money-wise, yes.
Okay.
And Taylorsville, there was one woman, well, not the congregation, but one woman in the congregation, and she lived in a farmhouse south of Taylorsville. Her husband had died, and she offered her house as a way station for people moving from St. Louis to Chicago or to us or wherever it is. So there were individual disciples who were willing to act if their congregation didn't. And there were a lot of those. How many, I don't know. But there were a lot of those.
Were there, I guess, noticeable numbers from here at that time?
Community place?
Yeah.
Well, all the members of the foundation board were members of Community Place at that time.
At the beginning of this period, not by the end.
The Lindstroms were very supportive in terms of physical labor and money. They helped us, for example, build a kitchen on the third floor, paid for all of it. And they continued to offer financial support, and in the construction company where we had trouble with the guy who had hired David, Dave was a great big man. And he knew how to intimidate by his physicalness. So he was the one that we went to get this contractor off the fence, and he pulled it off. So yes, there were individuals in the place who helped.
So back to the question of the rightward shift of so was it Roger? Was Roger representative of a breed of new disciple ministers, or were the churches really starting to move more rightward, or was UPCC at the vanguard of moving right?
I'll tell you the story about when the first so-called riots occurred on campus, and the elders called us together to accuse us of starting the riots. And the little elder who stood in my face and shook his finger saying, this congregation is a Republican congregation. It has always been a Republican congregation, and it will always in the future be a Republican congregation. So clearly in 1968, the backlash had started. So I think it was a gradual development, just like in the country. I don't think it's a too much of a secret that the U of I is the, at least in my opinion, is the most conservative of big ten schools in social policy. The county certainly is conservative in its basic political orientation. If it weren't for Champaign, if it weren't for Urbana, this would be a pretty miserable place.
So you mentioned the board, so I guess, and I'm not trying to fast forward too far, but so at 84, after the decision's made, you still have a whole disciples board for the foundation. So what started to happen? So by the end of that decade, they're mostly gone. And I know, because that's probably the next session when we rebuild the board and when Joe and I come on and other people. But what was going on? Was it because of Sanctuary? Was it because of the change in the country? Or was it just kind of the day in, day out of Sanctuary really wore down on people?
Well, the image that I used to help people wrestle with that problem was that IDF became a black hole in space. And if you got too close to IDF, you were going to get sucked into the black hole. And you'd better be prepared for that experience.
And this was partially because of the demands of Sanctuary.
Yeah, but there were all these other things going on too. And it felt like a black hole to me because I was sucked into it. There was pressure coming from Bloomington because people were using IDF. Well, there was the Shelbyville event. The Disciple Heritage Group was beginning to form up in the 80s. And Shelbyville was one of the most conservative congregations in the state, but also one of the wealthiest. And so at some point in time, toward the end of that decade, it decided it was going to withdraw all support of its outreach money that would go to IDF. So they notified the regional office that that was their decision. And then Pete Smith, as the regional minister, called me. No, he didn't call me. He wrote me a letter saying this is what's happened. But Pete also included this piece of data that he had taken their outreach giving record and figured out what percentage of it went to IDF, and it came to 8 cents of a dollar. On every dollar they gave, 8 cents of it came to us. So, and he made that public throughout the region. Well, that made Shelbyville Church very happy, apparently, that none of their money was coming to IDF. But Danville Central, who had never voiced any support at all, wrote a letter to Pete and said, well, whatever Shelbyville Church is withdrawing from the region for IDF, we will make up for it. So Pete then had to come back into it and come out, okay, you will have to give 8 cents more than you're giving in order for IDF to make up the difference. So it was a double whammy for
This
Pete.
was, and it was around Sanctuary.
Yeah,
This was.
Then there was the guy who founded Disciple Heritage, who was at a church in Decatur, who was arguing that the church had forgotten that the denomination, and particularly Illinois, Wisconsin, had forgotten the primary purpose of the denominations, which was to bring salvation to the world, and that it was clearly forgotten it because it was supporting IDF, which was a communist organization. So Pete asked me to address it. So I wrote an editorial in The Voice. What's the difference between communism, capital C, and communism, small c? And that kicked this guy off, and he then wrote another big editorial about how nomination should withdraw from IDF totally, blah, blah, blah. So then there was a whole flock of letters from various pastors all over. Well, Jim, are you really a communist? What's all this about? So I had to go to these congregations, or I had to write them letters. And gradually that argument died down. That is, I convinced most of them that, well, what I did was that I listed all the passages in both the Old Testament and the New Testament that advocated communism, a communal way of living. And so then I began to get letters from pastors and said, you know, we've had meetings with our elders and we've studied all these passages and, you know, you're right.
Could have just read
Mark,
Miranda.
But this took months. This took months.
Lots of time on your part.
To do this. So, and at the same time, you had all these other things. So it was definitely a black hole. And once you entered it, you know, you either died, retired, left, or you just went on through the hole. So that was how I was interpreting it. IDF was a black hole, and if you're not ready for that, don't get too near us.
So that's what was starting to burn out the board members.
Well, we had a rotating board. 3 people went off every year. 3 new people had to be elected. Now, the first interesting thing that happened was that folk heard about IDF being a public sanctuary. And because they couldn't make the difference between these 2 buildings, they would join University Place Church on Sunday morning. And then they would go to Roger and say, I want to be a part of the sanctuary unit. And Roger would then deliver whatever University Place Church's position was to those people. And on one occasion, the individual, after joining Uni Place, came and said, I want to be a member of the board. And we put her name up, and she met with the committee, and she looked okay, and so she was elected. Her husband worked for the university, and she went home. I guess he hadn't joined the church, and she went home and told him what had happened, and he hit the roof. So the next day she came back and said, I've got to withdraw because my husband fears his job is in jeopardy. So she entered her resignation, and we had to accept it. Then another thing began to happen. We went to Eric Freifogel. He moved here from Indianapolis. We got word from Indianapolis sources that this is a very liberal lawyer, and he will be good for you. And sanctuary movement. So I went to visit Eric and found out that his view was that congregations should not engage in any political activity whatsoever. So that was another reason.
This is the guy who's the current moderator, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it became increasingly difficult to find disciples. But we had already changed the Constitution by that time, that only 50% of the board had to be disciples. So we turned to some non-disciples who were active in Quakos, and they came on board.
And food co-op people started coming on the board then too, right?
Yeah, some of them did. But then there was the big battle in the food co-op, because some folk who were members of the food co-op began to see the posters in food co-op bulletin boards that said, we're going to have this event with David and Ava, or whoever the refugees were with us, and we'll hear about Central America and why we're supporting this, that, and the other. And so then those people who came from other churches, like Lutherans or whatever, would come and say, you know, I'm opposed to this event, and I don't want to be a part of the food co-op because it's supporting this. And so the food co-op began to waffle. That was probably taking place in 88, 89, maybe a little earlier than that, but certainly around that time. So by the rotation system, between say 83 '83, when we voted to become a public sanctuary in '89, there were only 5 or 6 board members left on the board, period.
By the end, by '89.
89, yeah. So Dave Duncan was chairperson. Marion Yarber was the chair of the nominating committee, and we had to report that he couldn't find anybody. So Dave said, well, we gotta move to.
So partly people were like this woman, afraid of what the repercussions would be while public sanctuary was still in full bloom. Partially there was a general rightward shift in lots of things, and then there was the burnout factor.
So we started, the first step was to change the Constitution so that we could approach non-disciples with no restriction, no quotas.
At this point, when you were changing the Constitution, was the region aware of the problem that you were facing?
Yes. Because that was one of the complaints they were getting. You don't have any disciples on the board, not true disciples.
Yeah.
And so we had to report, well, all the members on the board in the early days were disciples, so we reported that. And so then after a while, we had to start reporting, we can't fill all these spots.
There's no disciples willing to do it.
Right. So, and we weren't getting much support from that stage, so I wrote letters to all the presidents of all the higher education units, campus ministry units, and colleges and seminaries, what their situation was. And what came back was, hey, most of our board members aren't disciples either. And colleges' answer was, look, we couldn't get federal money if we showed that our board was very closely tied to the denomination, so we've had to move away from that. That way we can still get federal money. So that was their answer. Seminaries are not quite in the same boat, but they had learned that generally speaking, disciples don't have a lot of money, so they go after it really does have a lot of money. And who happen to be religious in some way, so there weren't a whole lot of disciples on their boards either. And campus ministry had hardly any disciples on any board anyway. In fact, we were the only disciple campus ministry left.
So that was basically the trend.
That was the trend. So when Pete would argue about this, I'd say, hey, there aren't any disciples on any of these boards. And finally, he, I guess, made contacts himself and found out that was true. So no longer any complaints about that.
Well, I want to save the rebuilding for the next.
Okay.
But I have a couple questions. These are kind of broad, they're just in my head. So, one, I'd like to address what else was IDF doing besides sanctuary in this period. 2, to address David and Ava and how and the changing nature of once they left, how sanctuary did change. And 3, how the changing nature to IDF's finances, or what was, as the shift was happening, and Martine kind of asked before about like the funders, but was, and then you mentioned the region stuff, but what was happening with the IDF's finance? Those are my 3 very broad questions.
Okay.
I don't care
Well,
which way you address them.
all of the activities that had been going on prior to moving into public sanctuary, even watch the radical readings of The Voice, the fundraising, maintaining contact with the region and the various campus ministries. That all the campus ministries were very supportive of what we were doing. The national levels of the discipledom, the Division of Higher Education, there was a subunit there for campus ministers, and a lot of our, in fact, all of the money that comes to IDF from the region is processed originally at the national level through the Division of Higher Ed, so you have to keep those channels open. And the only way you can do that is participate in those activities. Then then the local stuff, the anti-apartheid stuff was going on, the nuclear free stuff was going on. We were still doing some of the militarization research stuff for the World Student Federation that continued up to 80. Well, that ended in 83. So all of those kinds of things continued to go on. Weddings continued to go on. Funerals continued to go on. Counseling continued to go on.
But some of the other things started to fall away as more and more energy was put into sanctuary and Quakos. Correct? Incorrect?
No,
No.
that's part of the black hole.
Okay.
It just expanded.
Everything was going down the black hole.
But like the van and some of the neighborhood service ministry stuff was all gone by the end of the 80s except for the food co-op, right?
Well, the neighborhood service ministry ended once we moved, in my mind, ended when Peaceful Justice as Priority came online. But the food co-op continued, yes. And it, for example, decided one of the things that it had going was workers had to put in 10 hours, and they had 8 teams working the food co-op, the regular food co-op activities, and they had more workers than they needed for that. So the Pizza Resource Library then became another way for the food co-op for workers to gain their 10 hours. So the Pizza Resource Center began to develop resources. And you remember the number of magazines and things that we...
That's at the end of the 80s.
Yeah, right. But those were building up during that time, so that activity was still going on. We had put together, one of the things that had happened in the Peace Resource Center was that we put, there was one congregation up at Hoopston, who the city was having troubles with their water sanitation stuff, so they called and said, could you help us with that? So we put together, using resources in the university that dealt with water sanitation, we put together a team of consultants to go deal with Hoopston. The pastor of the church in Hoopston was a member of their village council or whatever it's called. So that resource is neat. We had a number of things like that people would call and say, can you help us with this? And so we'd try to do that. That was more haphazard than a regular part of the program, but we responded to that. There was the problem of putting together with PACA, actually it was PACA's program, but every 4th of July we had to put together a float for the parade, so we would join our 2 things and work on those.
That was one of my early participations too. I think 4th of July in '85, I was in lawnmowers for the Contras.
Yeah, the lawnmower for the conference was one of our best ones.
So that was, we were out in the parking lot. It was Gaudier was the cheerleader. But so we all had lawnmowers, and we would do these little maneuvers when she blew the whistle, and that was, we were saying, let's give humanitarian aid to the Contras, and that was lawnmowers for the Contras. That was my first parade I marched in. We had applause because we did good maneuvers.
Well, we were good. We were good.
Nobody got what the point was.
In fact, the spinoff was that the American Legion has put together their own lawnmower drill team, and they show up at every 4th of July program ever since.
With no politics attached.
With no politics attached.
But so
then we got stuck with all those damn lawnmowers we had.
I mean,
It took a year to get rid of them. No, somebody had to get rid of them, and who got rid of them? I got rid of them.
So when did David Neva leave?
Oh,
Or I guess the question is, who came in next?
I think it was the summer of, let's see, Reagan was reelected in '84, so it was in the summer of '85, I think, when they left.
So they were, no, that was less than a year then.
They were here about a year and a half.
That's all?
Yeah.
Yeah, so when I saw them was right near the end of
Mhm.
their time.
And the reason they left was that was when INS hit Tucson. And
So they left the summer of '85?
it was the summer or the fall.
Huh.
Anyway, they hit the screening sanctuary workers there too, arrested them and confiscated their files, and David Neva's files were a part of that system. And so the word got out to them that they needed to be aware of that and take what action they needed. So we had to figure out how to get them out of town. There was a way to get to, there was a route that had already been worked out to get them to Canada. And they had to go to Gomer, Georgia, where they were trained for about 6 weeks on how to answer Canadian authority questions, both oral and written. Then they had to go to Washington, D.C. In order to get transported to Canada through Buffalo. So that took a long time to figure all that out and get it done.
Have you had contact with them since they moved up there?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And they're still in Canada?
No, I do not know that.
Oh, okay.
Contact Bobby Trisk again comes into the picture. We lost contact because Bobby Trisk lost their address.
So then then what next? So Quakos was for a while a public sanctuary with no refugees, or somebody came in pretty quickly then.
No, we did a evaluation that took us probably about 6 months to finish that. And in the meantime, we hit Urbana for the City of Refuge and pulled that off. That took about 9 months to get that passed.
But there were no refugees that came through after them?
Oh, yeah.
Or there were.
Okay.
But who was next? So the Guatemalans next?
Ana Mendez and Juan Mendez. From there, 2, 3 children.
From Guatemala.
From Guatemala.
And that was when?
Probably late '86, beginning '87.
And then
they stayed probably, well, they had lots of family already here. And they were here probably, that is in the country. Their family was, a bunch of them were already in the country. Most of them here in Illinois, unfortunately. So as a group, they decided they were going to flee to Canada. And I think that move came in '88. And they decided to leave from here, so we ended up with 50-some odd people living upstairs.
that's when
Getting
was Ron,
ready.
and Ron was already living up there at that point, right?
Probably.
I think so.
Anyway, we had a bunch of people to move to Canada, and it took 3 vans to make that move to Detroit.
And wasn't there one more group of Guatemalans afterwards?
Paco, Alberto. They were all related too. And they had some cousins who were in migrant worker camps nearby. So we had quite a few families visiting.
And that was from like when till when?
That was up through '91. And that was when we began to get harassment from, Alberto and his brother would go over to Nature's Table. And some guys would meet them outside and beat them up, chase them back here, they'd call the cops. And by that time, the guys would disappear. So when we did the early chief stuff, we had the Department of Education here. And I gave testimony about how people from FBI was it FBI who was here, Joe? You gave testimony like that too.
Wasn't
I
the
don't think
FBI.
it was just the people from the Department of Education,
Education, yeah.
Civil
Civil
Rights
Rights Committee or Commission.
Committee, right?
And I finished doing my testimony, the two people left. Well, later they asked me to come out and talk to them. I said, we don't want to hear any more of this. Came back in.
So this is my impression. I wanted to, whether it's correct or incorrect. So my impression was as the end, as Quakos, as public sanctuary near the end, kind of like as it ended, and for a variety of conditions, that it stopped being public sanctuary, that it was just sanctuary, and I don't know if it was for both groups of the Guatemalans or if it was just the second group, but they didn't do any public events. There was no public speaking. So it became harder to keep alive the network of monitors and things like that because the nature of public sanctuary had shifted.
Right. Well, in 89-90 was when we won the trial case on appeal of the arrests of 72 refugees in Tucson and 18 sanctuary workers. They were all convicted and the 72 refugees were deported. But the trial went on under appeal, and we finally won it in the Ninth District Court. And the government was then ordered to desist from arresting political refugees and sanctuary workers. So the sanctuary movement died because without a case.
But was it just my impression, or was after David and Ava, did the public activities of the refugees lessen?
The activities began to fall off from the co-sponsoring units because of the court case.
Okay. So because of the larger context of the crackdown on the sanctuary movement,
Right.
Quaco started to lose members, and then the question of who was coming into sanctuary was also changing as well.
Right. And another factor was coming in. The people who had been committed to bringing about some degree of systemic justice to an unjust systemic system, whose commitment was too bad, left.
Left what?
Left. I mean, they quit being monitors. There was no, from their point of view, the battle had been won.
Oh, in Quacos.
Yeah.
Because it began won. Why?
Because the battle
The
was over.
court case had been.
The court case had been won.
Oh,
And the government had lost.
got it.
So that left folk who had been engaged in public sanctuary who were more interested in the humane, charitable treatment of people who no longer had a political reason for being threatened.
And then there were changes in El Salvador at this point. It was in 1990 when the elections took place, and
Well, 1990, both sides had fought their way into a stalemate,
yeah.
and negotiations began, and political.
So that whole
arrangement.
context started changing
Yeah,
too.
it was in 92 was when the peace accords were developed, I think it was.
Well, the end of the 80s saw the dissolution of all solidarity movements.
Right.
I mean, at least U.S. support, and so that changed the nature of a lot of things.
And for IDF, my attention shifted off of public sanctuary to the Iran-Contra issues, pressing for the impeachment of Reagan. That was in the late 80s too.
It's 87, 88?
Yeah.
Well, 87, because the election in 88, Reagan wasn't running. So 87 was when all the stuff on the Iran Contra
Right.
came up.
So that was a shift too. Also, as I said earlier, during that first bit with David and Ava, the chain of command, I probably paid that too hard because the Quakers were not happy with me over that. So during the evaluation, that chain of command was absolved. And
After David and Ava left?
Mhm. And the core group moved to an all-command consensus process. And if it was not able to reach a consensus process, then it fell to the folk who were chief executives in the 5 institutions that resolved it. McKinley was, and we came to a couple of places like that. McKinley was the troublemaker at that. We had Alberto's had to leave Guatemala in a hurry. He and his father had I want to say goat herds, and there were public lands which they took their flock of goats. Is goats right? A flock? It's whatever it is.
Yeah.
Sheep are a flock.
A sheep are a flock.
Goats
I don't
are
know
a
what that
gaggle.
is. Anyway, so they were
think
using
so.
public lands for grazing their livestock. And so some plantation owner showed up and shot them both, killed the father. Alberto was able to make it back to his house. His mother hid him out. And took care of his wounds. And then sent him into Mexico. And he made his way to the U.S. Whoever it was who did the shooting found out about his mother, and so they came and shot her. She survived the shooting. Somehow the villagers got her to Guatemala City to a doctor there who said he would do the surgery that was necessary, but he needed money to do it. So we got $10,000 together, and 3 Quecos members who spoke fluent Spanish agreed to take it to Guatemala City through Mexico, hike on into Guatemala and get to Guatemala City. So they did that. And then they came back out through the same route. This meant a lot of walking through dangerous territory. So Quecos had to make a decision about raising the money and undertaking this enterprise. McKinley did not want to hear about this. We had a special meeting to make the decision, and we got about 15-20 seconds into describing what the situation was, and the McKinley representative said, we don't want to hear any more. This is not proper discussion for this organization, and we won't be a party to it. So they left. So the other representatives decided to go ahead, and so we did that. So we broke discipline at that point.
That was the third group of refugees.
That was the second.
Second group, sorry. Who didn't one of the Guatemalans end up getting married and staying in town?
Yeah, that was Paco.
That's Paco. That's who I still see around. Who did he marry? One of the translators.
Bonnie.
Huh?
Her first name is Bonnie. I don't remember what her last name was.
Because they're still in town, right?
Yeah.
I can never remember his name. I'd run into him all the time and say hi, but
Yeah, she was a real active person in Quecos.
no, I remember her. as
She
well.
was a teacher, and there's no accounting for who falls in love with who, so they fell in love and they got married.
When did you go to El Salvador?
Okay.
I just wanted to ask that.
I was going to wrap it up, and that's one thing we need to talk about next time.
Yeah, but I just wanted, when was it?
What question?
When did you go to El Salvador?
Oh, 87.
87, okay.
So what I wanted to do was wind down, and for the next time, I think, we want to talk about your trip to El Salvador, because we need to talk about that. Maybe talk about the IDF finances in the 80s, how things were changing, and then
How the co-op was changing.
how the co-op was changing,
Yeah.
and the rebuilding of the board in the 90s.
Into the early 90s,
Okay, send me an email about that so I can.
Sure, and probably
Because I can collect some stuff.
maybe the end of Quecos, because this wasn't quite the end, but Because it's
Yeah,
still hung on.
Quaco- The sanctuary movement ended. Quakos did not. It
Okay.
continued for another 3 or 4 years. And in fact, it probably still exists.
I remember in the early nineties when I got here, I still heard some couple of things.
Yeah, it was still
Waco's.
Well, then the name got changed to be even longer.
Yeah.
'Cause then it was the Caribbean too, got
Right,
thrown in there.
right.
But after the last refugees, it really lost.
It largely-
Because it was down, wasn't it down to just like the Unitarians and
St.
the
Mary's,
Quakers and IDF?
Channing Murray
January, yeah.
and me. No, once
Was St.
we
Mary's
got
still there?
91, at the end of the National Sanctuary meeting in 1991 in Chicago, that was when the sanctuary movement declared itself dissolved. And we got back and reported that it was over, and the board said, okay, we're done. But we can continue on supporting Quakos, so I did. But
We
the
had
rest of the
first-
involvement of people fell off.
Because the first Gulf War got in the way at that point.
Yeah, things shifted gears. Well, I've got some stuff to show you.
Okay, finish the other stuff so that we can get back. Don't want Dolores on our ass.
Yeah, now this,
Asking where-
this covers a period of time. Here are some photographs on the ERA stuff.
Yeah.
Here's what the board looked like in 1980-81.
2 people.
80-81 was still strong, but
Oh,
89-90.
Here's the food co-op in its first year, and then 1980-81.
Wow, a lot of photos. Look at Jim, a lot of photos.
Here's the Global Awareness Seminar photos on Liberation Theology in Latin America, 1981. Here's the Bocumba Family and Sanctuary in 81-84. Here's the Reagan demonstration over at Eureka.
You know, there's another thing, Jim, I think we need to talk about maybe next time. I don't know if we talked about the story about the altar in the chapel,
Okay.
because I don't think we've told that for the oral history.
And here's stuff
Probably
on-
didn't talk about the windows either. We should probably talk about the chapel in general.
Here's the Quakos Paco
These are all marked
90
up there.
processing sanctuary. And the annual dinners. Here's the March on Washington, D.C. Here's the Foundation Board in 1991-92.
You really dug this stuff up.
Which march on DC was that? The 89-91, Jim, where you and I stood outside in the rain
Yes.
for hours?
Yes.
Damn that
And
march.
here's just some general stuff in 1990, 91, 92, kind of just pictures about the new frontier. And here's the letter to Roger Jenks. So,
January 85.
Is this Jim playing baseball here? Playing softball?
yeah, I think so.
Oh, there's Rick Boyd. We're gonna have a session on Rick Boyd? Huh?
Let's don't. Yeah, we probably should have a story about Rick Boyd.
Okay, I'm gonna hit pause.